Thanks, Declan. I am excited, I'm sure as you are, to get started with our webinar today. Like Declan said, my name is Steve Faithful. I'm the CEO of GiftWorks, and we make fundraising software. We like to call it smart fundraising software that helps organizations accomplish their mission. And we really count it a privilege to host today's free webinar. And I know I'm excited, I know Declan is, and I know Linda's excited to be able to bring you the information that we have today. So thanks for taking time to invest in yourself and your organization. Today we're going to be bringing you the webinar titled Building a Fundraising Board, and I know Linda's going to share a lot of things about how to get a board behind the things that you're doing to ensure that you're successful at your mission. When you did register for this webinar, you were asked a brief question about GiftWorks fundraising software, and for those of you who indicated that you might want to know more about GiftWorks, we're going to have someone from our sales team contact you and just talk to you about if GiftWorks might be able to help you in your organization. A few really quick comments about the technology that we're using to deliver this webinar today, and it's GoToWebinar. I'm sure many of you are already connected, and you should see Linda's presentation screen right in front of you. If you have any issues with the audio or video part of today's webinar, you're probably going to want to either maybe restart GoToWebinar, or for those of you who might have audio problems, call in using the phone number that was provided in the email. I know there's going to be opportunities at the end to ask questions of Linda as well, and you can find the little question panel in I think in your control panel area on the right side of your screen, and you're going to be able to give questions there. So maybe while we're at it, if you could find that question panel and just go say hi to Declan. I know Declan's monitoring all those questions. So if you just say a quick hi to Declan, let him know maybe where you're from, maybe your city, your state, or your province. That will make sure that he knows that all of you have found the question panel okay. Another thing before I hand it over to Linda in just a moment, many of you are probably going to be asking whether or not we're recording this webinar, which we are right now, and that we're going to be sending out a link after the webinar is over that you're going to be able to share this webinar with your colleagues or listen to it again if for some reason you're not able to listen to the entire thing, or you just want to re-listen to it to make sure some of the information settles in. So we will be sending that out. You'll be getting that probably within the next 24 hours after the webinar is done. Well, a few words about Linda Lizakowski before I turn it over to her. First of all, a huge thanks to her for spending the time. We don't pay her to do this, and she doesn't pay us to be able to do this. This is a partnership that we have together. Linda, if you don't know her, she is the president of Capital Venture Fundraising. She is one of, I think, fewer than 100 professionals worldwide to hold what's called the ACFRE designation. That's the Advanced Certified Fundraising Executive designation. She is a great friend to GiftWorks. We have been so privileged to work with her for a number of years, and we're excited that she's here today to be able to share information with you. So without further hesitation, let me turn it over to Linda Lizakowski. Linda, thanks.
Thank you, Steve. And as Steve said, it really is a pleasure for me to be here working with GiftWorks. We've had a long-standing relationship, and I think very highly of their product, obviously, or I wouldn't be here doing this webinar. There's one other thing that I wanted to add as far as questions. I know we only have an hour, and sometimes people have to jump off because they really need to get to another meeting, or there's something pressing waiting for them. So I do want to let you know that the very last slide in this presentation, I'm going to give you my personal email address. So if you don't get a chance to ask your question, or if you ask a question and we don't have time to answer them all, feel free to email me anytime after this. And there might be some things I might be referring to throughout the webinar that you can either access from my website, or I'll be happy to email you directly. But I always want to let everyone know that no question will go unanswered. So just to kind of let you know that in advance. This topic today is one of my favorite ones to talk about because I've been consulting for almost 25 years now. In fact, it might be more than 25 years. Time flies by pretty quickly sometimes. But one of the things that I have found is no matter whether I'm going in to do a development audit for a client, or if I'm working on a capital campaign, or if I'm helping with our annual fundraising, probably the most common complaint that I hear from people is, we can't get our board to do fundraising, and we don't know how to introduce fundraising to our board. And sometimes it's some of you that are on this call are probably executive directors that maybe don't even have a director of development, so you're the ones who are dealing directly with getting your board to raise funds. in some cases, some of you may be directors of development or hold other development positions, and sometimes it's not only your board, but sometimes your CEO doesn't even understand fundraising. So I want to start, I think, by talking a little bit about how your board views fundraising. And these are some of the most common misconceptions about fundraising that I hear from boards and sometimes from CEOs. One is the tin cup mentality, that people think fundraising is begging. And I was just talking to someone the other day that said, oh, I got another one of those begathon letters from XYZ nonprofit. And so there are many people out there, particularly board members, who think of fundraising as somehow begging for money. That's certainly not true. That's not a good way to look about fundraising. Another common misperception is, well, we know we have to do it, but it's kind of a necessary evil. We don't really want to do fundraising, but we know we have to, so we'll do it, but we're going to bite the bullet, and they go about it with a very negative attitude. There are some organizations whose board members don't even think they need to raise funds. I remember once sitting in a board meeting of an organization that was hiring its very first development director, and believe it or not, the board chair said, well, I don't understand why we need to do fundraising. Don't we get government grants and contracts? Why do we need this fundraising stuff anyway? And what she didn't realize is that there were a lot of needs that the organization had that were not covered by government grants and contracts. Sometimes people say, well, I know somebody has to do fundraising, but let's just go hire a director of development, and then, oh boy, we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's not my job. It's the director of development. That's why we hired that person. That's also not a realistic approach, because really, if you're working for a nonprofit, whether you're the executive director, whether you're an unpaid member, a board member, whether you're the front desk receptionist, fundraising is really everybody's job in a nonprofit. One of the things that I hear a lot of times is, I just don't know how to do fundraising. I know that our organization needs it, and I want to help, but I don't know how to get started. And then sometimes I hear people, especially board members, say, well, I don't want to bug my friends and ask them to support this organization, because then they're going to ask me to support all the organizations that they're involved with. So I want to try to, throughout this next hour, kind of dispel some of those misperceptions that are out there about fundraising, because to me, fundraising is one of the most rewarding and exciting professions there is in the world, and I just love the whole attitude of fundraising, and I love when I see somebody just take away that tin cup mentality, and kind of the light starts to shine at the end of the tunnel, and they say, oh, fundraising really is fun too, and it's exciting, and it's something that our organization can't survive without. And once they learn how to do it, that bullet item that says I don't know how is a big hang-up for a lot of people. If they were more comfortable with it, they would feel like they wanted to get out and help you raise funds. So one of the things that you have to do is dispel this perception of, I always like to throw a little bit of humor in here. There are 4 stages to the donor cultivation cycle: ask, plead, cajole, and beg. And that's certainly not how we want anybody to look at fundraising. But those people who have that tin cup mentality often do think that it's pleading for money, it's begging people for money, and getting people to part with money that they don't want to part with. And that really is not the case. People give for a lot of valid reasons, and I think we need to, first of all, understand the whole psychology of philanthropy. So when I work with boards, I try to get them thinking about who gets money, what type of organizations are out there that are really successful at raising money, and who's giving that money, where does that money come from. And then one of the ways that I like to do this with board members is to ask them to think about their own giving. And when they start to put it in a more personal aspect, it really starts to make a little bit more sense. So I like to ask board members who they're supporting and why they support those organizations. And the answers that you get will range from, well, gosh, somebody I know really well asked me to give to this organization and I couldn't say no, or one of my family members was helped by this organization, or I really feel passionate about what they're doing because it's a cause that's near and dear to my heart. And you'll hear a lot of different answers. You also hear a lot of different answers when you ask the question is who don't you give to, because there are many reasons that people don't give or stop giving to organizations. They're either asked too often, they're not asked enough. One of the things that prompts most people not to give is either they aren't asked at all, or they're asked for money, but they never hear from the organization any other time except when they're being asked for money. And one of the biggest reasons that people continue to support organizations is because they understand that the organization communicates with them and tells them what they're doing with their money. There's a study that was done a number of years ago by Carnegie Mellon, and they said that the one thing that people wanted more than anything else from the organizations that they supported was to know how their money was being used. And so often we don't do that. So this is a way that board members can help you by telling people how their money is used and by really showing people that their money is going for something that they do care very deeply about. So the other part of this equation is as far as where people give, and this is one of the lessons that I find many board members really struggle with. I talk to a lot of organizations that their answer to fundraising is, well, we're going to go out and hire a grant writer, and we're just going to sit them at a desk and let them crank out grants all day, and that's going to solve all of our fundraising problems. And some of you may be familiar with the Giving USA statistics. I know we have some Canadians on board, and I think there's some similar statistics for Canada. And if we have people from other countries, you may have something available similar to this as well. But Giving USA is published in the United States every year. And actually, the 2011 statistics just came out this week, so it was too late to get them into this presentation. But actually, they didn't change very much. The figures are pretty close, and the actual percentages, I think, came out just about identical. The one area that grew a little bit was bequests, but bequests are really from individuals, so I like to add those two together when I talk about these statistics. And the people who say, well, we're going to just hire a grant writer, they're looking at targeting 14% of the funding that comes in this country. So they're really missing out on the 81% of the funding that's coming from individuals through either individual giving or bequests, because bequests are always from an individual. So when you look at this, foundations are only giving typically about 14% of the money, and corporations are giving about 5%. So if your fundraising is limited to grant writing and going out and asking corporations to sponsor your events, you're missing a whole world of fundraising that's out there. And board members really need to understand some of these concepts. So when I do presentations for boards, I like to talk about the fact that you've got to have a really integrated development program that appeals to all the different potential funders that you have. So one of the questions I often ask people is whether or not their board knows the golden rule of fundraising. And in some instances, I get the answer of, yeah, I know the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And that's not really always a fundraising rule. Sometimes that does happen with foundations. If you want their money, you have to abide by their rules. But what I'm talking about is called the 95-5 rule. And as I said, I've been in development for more than 25 years now. And when I first entered this field, this rule was actually called the 80-20 rule. And some of you may remember from your college days Pareto's 80-20 rule that says 80% of the outputs generally come from 20% of the people doing the work. And that same thing held true in fundraising, that typically about 80% of all money that's given to your organization used to come from about 20% of your donors. But in recent years, we've had so many more major gift opportunities and planned gifts that that ratio has now altered, that it morphed into the 90-10 rule, and now most experts are saying it's more like the 95-5 rule, that 5% of your donors actually account for about 95% of the money that you get within your organization. So one of the things that board members need to realize is that you can't raise money successfully if you're spending 95% of your time going after the 95% of your donors who are only giving you 5% of the money, that you really need to focus on some of those major gift asks. And that's where your development team comes in, the team of staff, board, and other volunteers. So the staff, the development function really can't be just left up to staff. It has to be a team effort. And the board plays a big role in that effort, but there's other volunteers that can get involved too. The staff members play a role, from the CEO down to, as I said earlier, the receptionist that answers the door or answers the phones for people. So it's really important that you look at fundraising as a team effort, that you don't just hire a director of development and say, okay, that's her job now or that's his job now, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. So I want to talk about some of the roles that board members play in fundraising. And for those of you who are thinking that your board members don't get involved in fundraising at all, it may be that they are getting involved and you haven't even thought about it. For example, has your board put together policies in regard to fundraising? One of the things that I always talk to people about is having gift acceptance policies in place, so you know who you're going to accept gifts from, what you're going to do with those gifts when you get them. Do you keep gifts of stock, or do you sell them and turn them into cash that you can use right away for your program? Do you want to take gifts of real estate, gifts of art, all of those kind of things? And this is a decision that your board has to make. And getting your board involved in some of this decision making is a great way to help them understand the whole process of fundraising a lot better. So if you can start them slowly, instead of just getting a board member saying, okay, now board, we're going to have to raise money, so give us the name of all your friends and go out there and talk to them. You start by getting them involved in things like setting policies for fundraising, monitoring your revenue streams. Boards need to know where your funding comes from. That board member that I mentioned earlier that didn't understand why the organization even needed to raise money because she knew the organization got government grants. Well, yes, but those government grants only covered maybe 80% of their revenue. They had to make up the rest of it through other alternatives like fundraising. So board members need to understand what your funding streams are and how tenuous some of those funding streams can be. I think anybody who depends on government grants knows this. I worked in the past year with a bunch of organizations who had a major big federal grant, and all of a sudden that grant was pulled without any warning, and so they all had to scramble to make up other ways to make up that money. So getting your board involved in putting together your development plan is another great step. Once they're involved in putting together the plan, they're going to see their role in implementing it. And a lot of times I talk to boards who say, well, gosh, you know, our board, I put together this great development plan and our board doesn't help me implement it. Well, my first question to them is always, well, were they involved in putting the plan together? Because if not, they're not going to be involved in implementing it. So you need to get them involved in the planning process. You also need to get the board to give. That's one of the big things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the board's own giving, because anyone who doesn't give to an organization is not going to be able to go out and ask others to give. It's just not going to work. So I think one of the first things that we should talk about is, you know, do we have the right board? Maybe some of us have recruited board members, never letting them know that they were going to be responsible for fundraising. So I think it's important that we ask ourselves some questions like, how do we choose candidates for the board? Do we talk to people in advance and find out whether they're willing to do fundraising, whether they've ever done it before? You know, evaluating the candidate's commitment to your organization is sometimes tough, because sometimes we're really tempted that we just want to go out and fill seats with warm bodies, and we don't really take the time to evaluate whether this potential board member is committed to our organization enough to want to help us raise funds. Do they really strongly support your mission and your vision? That's a critical role of the board member. Do they really feel like they own the organization, that they're the fiduciary responsible parties, that if the organization fails, it's their fault, really. They're the ones who are on the line. So they have to feel that ownership, that they really have a vested interest in making your organization succeed. And you have to discuss this fundraising role. I talk to a lot of people that say, well, we have a job description that says our board's expected to give and get. But I've personally witnessed a lot of recruitment processes where, yes, they might have it in the job description, but when they get to that job description item, when they get to that bullet item, they tend to gloss over it or ignore it or even apologize for it because they say, well, I know it says you have to give and get, but we really want you on the board. And they somehow think that if they gloss over it now, that once the person's on board, they're all of a sudden going to become this fantastic, enthusiastic fundraiser. And they're not if it wasn't discussed in the beginning. So be open and honest with potential board members. If you expect them to give and you expect them to raise money, let them know right up front. And if they're not willing to embrace that role, then you might suggest to them that, well, gosh, maybe, the board position isn't the right position for you with our organization. Maybe you'd rather volunteer somehow and somehow get involved with our organization other than serving on the board. So don't be afraid to not only put that in your job description, but to make sure that the board members understand that. You also have to think about whether you've provided adequate education and training for the board. I've very seldom, in fact, I think once in all the boards I've worked with, I remember asking the question, how many of you wake up in the morning saying, I can't wait to go out and raise money for XYZ organization? And once I had a guy who raised his hand, so I put him on the spot and made him prove that he was ready to do that. But most of us don't feel like we want to go out and raise money for an organization unless we really know how to do it and why it's important. So we have to provide some education and training for your board. They're not born fundraisers. None of us are. I don't think any of us grew up thinking we want to be fundraisers when we grow up. That just doesn't seem to work. And I think you really have to be committed to work as a team. It's not just, okay, Mr. or Ms. Board Member, you give me those names and you go out and see those people. You have to provide not only the education and the training, but the support they need. And it really is a team effort. Fundraising is not something that anybody is going to be able to do in isolation. I want to go back to what I said earlier about board giving and why it's so important to fundraising. The basis for any board being successful fundraisers is, does this board support the organization themselves financially? And I guarantee you, if you have board members who are not willing to write out a check to your organization every year, and maybe more than once a year, they are not going to be successful fundraisers, because board members have that fiduciary responsibility. Really, they're where the buck stops. If you might remember Harry Truman, he was president, I think, when I was born, probably, so I don't really remember him, but I remember hearing a lot about him, and one of the things I've always heard was he had a plaque on his desk that said, in the White House, that said, the buck stops here. And I think that's something that every board member should have, is a little plaque that sits in front of them at the board meeting that says the buck stops here, because they are the fiduciary responsible party for your organization. But they're also volunteers, and that makes a big difference. When a major gift is about to be solicited, sure, a staff member should be there and share all the details about the organization's budget and how many people are being served, and really they're the ones who are going to know the case for support. But when a board member steps up and says, you know, Joe, I know you really love this organization as much as I do, and I'm volunteering. I'm here because I really care about this cause, and, you know, I'm giving $50,000, and I would like you to join me by also investing $50,000 in this organization. It has a whole different ring because it's coming from a volunteer, and your board members are the people who really lend that credibility to your organization. I know that even if it's not a major gift, if I'm getting a letter that's asking me for a $25 gift, and that letter is signed by the CEO or the Director of Development or anybody within the organization, I have a totally different reaction if I would get that same letter and it's signed by a volunteer, a board member, or another community volunteer, because I immediately think, oh, they have the support of some pretty credible people in this community. And when people see that you have the support of your board members, they're going to also be willing to give. And today, funders expect to see that. Those of you who do a lot of grant writing probably know that many of the grants that you receive, especially from private foundations, not from government sources usually, but from private foundations, they often ask you the question, what's the level of giving from your board of directors? And if you can't say 100%, there are some foundations that won't even consider your gift. I know I don't know if we have anybody from Nevada on the line, but I live in Nevada, and the Western Nevada Community Foundation, which is in the Reno area, has actually an award that they give to every one of their grantees who has 100% board participation, and they make it clear that those proposals go to the top of their pile when they're considering who they should support, are the ones who have 100% participation. And let's face it, your board members really should care more than anybody else about this organization. I know sometimes I've gotten requests for support, and I go and look at their annual report, and if I don't see every board member on that list of givers, my first reaction is, well, if they don't care about the organization, why should I care? I'm not even going to send them my $25 or $50 if their board members aren't supporting them at all. So board giving is really important to your organization. So how do we help our board members understand this role? Well, I think it starts, as I said, in the board recruitment process, and then I want to talk a little bit also about the development committee and their role, and then we'll talk about the board appeal, how you approach your board members for gifts, and we'll talk a little bit about some board education and brainstorming ideas. So as I said, first it starts with the recruiting the right board members, and board recruitment should never be done haphazardly or just have one person on the board say, oh, I know somebody that would be a good board member, and the next thing you know, they're on the board. My worst nightmare with this was once sitting at a board meeting in December for an organization, and the CEO of the organization said, oh, you know, it's December. There's 3 of you whose board terms are ending, so we need some new faces in here for January. Does anybody have any ideas? That's a horrible way to recruit board members. You need to have a year-round governance committee that is constantly looking at what are the needs of our board, what skills and talents do we need, what demographics do we need to change on our board, do we really represent the community that we serve? And one of the roles that that governance committee does then is, first of all, identify what type of positions you do need on the board, what kind of people you need. They will help develop or refine the position description so that you know what it is that you're looking for in board members. And they interview prospective board members. And interviewing a prospective board member should be very much like interviewing a prospective staff member. You want people to really take this serious, to find out if they're the right fit. And my contention has always been that most nonprofits would be 100% more successful if they thought more about recruiting board members the way they think about recruiting staff. And what I mean by that is if you have a staff hire, you would probably never in a million years walk up and say, you know, I met that Steve and he's a pretty nice guy. I think I'll hire him to come work for us. And then Steve shows up Monday morning for work and says, okay, well, what do you want me to do? And you say, oh, well, we'll find something for you. I don't think any of you would hire a staff member like that. But if you look at reality, how many times have you hired, in quotation marks, board members that way, that you just run across somebody or it's somebody's neighbor or brother-in-law or sister-in-law, and you think, well, they're a good person, let's get them on the board, and then they show up at a board meeting and say, well, what am I supposed to be doing here? And you say, well, we'll find something for you to do. You really need to think about interviewing prospective board members with the same intent that you think about interviewing a potential staff member. Is this the right fit for your organization? And is this person willing to do the job that's outlined in the job description for them? And then you have to provide them orientation. But one caution about orientation, that is not the time to let board members know that they're responsible for fundraising. That should have been done in the identification and recruitment process, not once they're on board. And I think one thing that really is critical in this whole recruitment process is to understand that a board member needs to believe and support your mission. And if they don't, I don't care how successful they are, how wealthy they are, how well connected in the community, they're not going to be successful fundraisers if they don't really believe in the mission of your organization. So make sure in that recruitment process that these people are really committed to your organization. Now, what's the board's role in the development planning? Well, hopefully you have a development committee. If you don't, this might be one of the first things that you might want to do is get a development committee who will really focus on working closely with the Chief Development Officer, whether that's the CEO or the Director of Development or the Vice President of Institutional Advancement, whatever that title might be. The board needs to work really closely with the Development Office in putting together this plan. And a strong development committee is often the best way to turn around a weak board. I've worked with some organizations that have had really small boards and really weak boards, and boards that knew absolutely nothing about fundraising, and if they did know anything about it, didn't want to do it. And the way that we were able to turn around those boards is by building a strong development committee of people who were committed to fundraising, who would then be the people who went to the board and said, hey board, these are our plans for the development area, and here's how you need to help us implement these plans. So a strong development committee can really make a big difference in whether or not your board is going to be successful at fundraising. I want to kind of move on from that, and I know many of you probably have a lot of questions about that. Hopefully you're typing in your questions as we speak. But I want to go on and talk about the board appeal, because this is an area where I think many organizations really fall short. I remember once I had a friend who was been in development a pretty long time, and he had changed jobs. And he called me shortly after he took his new position, and he said, oh, Linda, I had to just call and vent to somebody. He said, I had my first board meeting last night, and it was awful. I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, it started out with the board chair saying, well, you know, we all have to support this organization, so here's your pledge cards, and I want everybody to fill one out and hand it to me before you leave tonight. And it was not really a board appeal. It was just, you know, you're expected to sign your pledge card, and that's it. I think the board appeal really needs to be a carefully thought out process. First of all, you need to make sure that 100% of your board is giving. Sometimes I get the question, in fact, almost every time I talk about this subject, I get the question of how much should we expect board members to give? And I think that's a really tough question to answer, first of all, because every organization is different. But secondly, it's not the amount of the gift that's as important as, do you have 100% giving from your board? And is every board member giving at what is a meaningful level for them, not for your organization, but for them? And a lot of times I see board job descriptions that say things like, board members must give $1,000 a year. And for some organizations that works, but for most organizations it's a disaster for several reasons. First of all, you have some people who would be great board members, but they can't give $1,000, so they're immediately disqualified from serving on the board. Or you have that in the job description and they gloss over it and say, well, I know it says that, but don't worry about it. You don't have to give $1,000. Well, if that's the case, then why put it in the job description in the first place? But I think the third and even more important reason is you may have some people on your board who are very capable of giving you $50,000, $100,000 a year, $10,000 a year, and maybe they're willing to give that, but if they see the job description that says board members are expected to give $1,000, I guarantee what you're going to get from them is $1,000, not 10 or 50 or 100,000. So rather than put dollar amounts to it, the way I like to see job descriptions written is that, okay, here you are, Mr. or Miss individual board member, we expect you, and you can put this right in your job description, we expect you as a board member to make XYZ charity one of your top 2 or 3 charitable priorities. And that makes it very clear that if this is a person who is capable of giving $100,000 a year, then you're going to get probably somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 a year from that person. If the person is capable of giving $100 a year, then you'll get $30 or $50 a year from them. And that's fine if that's what they're capable of giving. I think that's far more important than working with this, give or get policy that is so rigid and has dollar amounts and everybody gives an equal fair share. I know for some organizations that fair share concept sounds important, but everybody's fair share is going to be very, very different. So I think having it stated that it's a top priority for them really says that you want a meaningful gift from them. It's also important that the board commitment is done early. Most organizations I find are on a July to June fiscal year, so this is the perfect time of the year to be talking about this, because if that's the case in your organization, you're probably using the summer to do a lot of planning for your fundraising activities and events and things that are going to happen in fall. So this is a great time to go out to your board members. You don't need to have your case for support in place because these are board members. They know what your organization is all about. You can solicit them in July and August. So in September, when you're ready to write grant proposals and do year-end mailings and do other events and activities, you can say 100% of our board has already given. So I think that board appeal is a really important step. And it has to start with the chair of your board. Now, obviously, the chair of the board is probably going to need to be solicited by a staff member. But after that, it should come from the board members themselves. And I would set up a committee to evaluate board giving potential based on the 5-to-1 rule that I always like to use when I'm making personal solicitations. And that is that no board member is responsible for talking to more than 5 other board members. So you don't expect the board chair to go out and see 30 board members if you have 30 board members, but recruit a committee of 6 people of the board, people who have already given and already have shown that they're potential donors themselves, and then sit down and ask those board members in person, not just hand out a pledge card or send them a letter, but treat them like a major donor, because really that's what they are, a major donor to your organization. So once you've done the board appeal and you have all your board on board with giving, then you have to look at what kind of education they need to really help do fundraising for your organization. And one of the things that I find is some board members are going to be much more comfortable with this. Some are really going to be very shy. Some might need some one-on-one training if they feel uncomfortable. The best way, I think, to do this is team board members up. Take a really experienced board member who does feel comfortable with fundraising and team them up with a shyer board member, maybe one who hasn't done this before, and let them go out and make a couple calls together. I think it does a couple things. It raises the comfort level of the weaker board member, but it also helps the more experienced board member, because I find that oftentimes when you team people up, you'll find that one is a good talker and one might be a good listener. And listening is more important than talking when it comes to major gifts. So I think having a team approach is a really great way to get your board members more comfortable with the whole prospect of fundraising. Now, another question people always ask me when I talk about this topic is, well, our board absolutely doesn't want to do fundraising, and they weren't brought on with the thought that they were ever going to do fundraising. So how do we get them accustomed to it? And is there something they can do without ever asking for money? And there is a lot that board members can do. There's really several steps in fundraising, and one of them is the cultivation stage of getting board members to be comfortable with major donors. So one of the things they could do that absolutely does not involve making an ask for money at all is ask each board member to invite 3 people that they know to have lunch with your executive director or president or whatever your CEO is, in a year's time. Now, that's not a lot of asks, and I think every board member, I don't care who they are, what position they hold in the community, what their job is, or if they even have a job, everybody knows 3 people who could come in and have lunch with your executive director. Maybe it's the head of a foundation, maybe it's somebody from the Rotary Club, maybe it's an individual philanthropist. They don't have to do any asking, and even the executive director isn't going to do any asking the first visit. It's just to get to know your organization. If they don't know 3 people they want to invite individually, they could host an event. If they have a nice home, they could host a cocktail party in their home. They could have lunch at the country club if they belong to a country club. They could have 10 of their friends come in and have breakfast in your facility and take a tour of the facility so they can actually see the work that you do firsthand. There's many different type of events that board members can host, and every board member will find something different that works for them. So your staff job is really to work with the board members to find out what does work for them. Having the board do a thankathon is a great way to get them accustomed to talking to donors. And this, again, is not asking for money, but you might say, well, let's take all our major donors. And for some of you, a major donor might be $100. For some, it might be $1,000. For some, it might be $1 million. But let's take all our major donors and make sure that they get a personal phone call from one of our board members. And I find the best way to do this is get board members together. If you just give them names, they usually end up taking home the names and they never make the calls. But if your board meetings start at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, say, okay, the next board meeting, we're going to have people come in at 5:30, and we're going to give each board member 3 or 4 or 5 names of donors to call and just thank them for their gift. It's an amazing thing for the donors to receive a thank you call, because so few organizations do this that when the donors get this call from a board member, they feel really honored and really privileged, and they're more likely to give in the future. But it also has an effect on the board member. They, for the first time, maybe have actually had a conversation with the donor, and it really makes them feel great about what they're doing and about the donors. And I find this is a great way to get your board involved. Another thing they could do is arrange for speaking engagements. If they're a good speaker, they can do these themselves. But if they're shy about that, maybe they belong to a church group or a Rotary Club or a Chamber of Commerce where they could invite someone from your organization to come in and talk about the organization. Every board member should have that 30-second elevator speech at their fingertips. I've seen some people even write it down on a little business card size thing where they can quickly describe what your organization does when they do have the opportunity in an elevator or at a cocktail party where maybe they only have someone's attention for a minute, but to be able to really talk about your organization and what you do. Another thing that I find that people often do is, especially if your board members have reached middle age or beyond, they sometimes are at a stage where, you know, a birthday's coming around and you say, you've probably had this experience with your family members. Well, what do you want for your birthday? Oh, I don't really need anything. And oftentimes they don't, or they don't want more stuff. I know my husband and I celebrated our 50th anniversary a couple years ago, and I said to my kids, tell people I don't want any tchotchkes. I don't want any stuff. I don't want anything I have to dust or keep clean. You know, I would rather have a gift to a charity that I care about than have more stuff. People sometimes getting married later in life, they've both already have a house. They don't need a toaster. They already have 2 that they're trying to figure out what to do with one. They don't need towels. They don't need this or that. But maybe you could ask board members to think about your organization as a place for somebody to buy a gift, an anniversary gift, a birthday gift, a Christmas gift, whatever. The other thing that I think board members should always be aware of is just opening doors for you to come in and meet with their potential donors, whoever they know, whether they're friends, colleagues, business people that they do business with. There's so many ways that board members can really help open doors. So I think it's important that your board members understand that there's really 4 steps in fundraising: identifying, cultivating, soliciting, and then stewardship, and that they can play a role in all of these. I'm going to talk in a minute about identifying. We've already talked about cultivating donors, how the different type of events that they could do, stewarding donors, calling and thanking them for their gifts. Board members certainly should be encouraged to get involved in soliciting, but it might take them a while to feel comfortable with that. But just remember that that's only one of these steps. And the first step is identifying potential donors, particularly for an organization who doesn't really have a list of potential donors. Maybe you've only done grant writing up to this point or events, and you don't have a list of individuals that you can identify. So one of the things that you can do is getting your board involved in some brainstorming. And a lot of boards practice one of the fallacies that I think is one of the worst ideas to ever come across in fundraising, and that's what I call the give me 15 names syndrome. And for some reason there seems to be this magic number of 15, and I hear this all the time from organizations who say, well, we ask our board members to give us 15 names of their friends that we could ask for money, and nobody gave us any names, or one board member sent us names, or one board member sent us 3 names. And I think that 15 name fallacy really needs to be outlawed. So one of the things that I would recommend is that instead of just asking for names, that you give board members some ideas to get them rolling. And one of the things I have on my website, which I'll give you that link at the end, is what I call a brainstorming form. And as a form to get people thinking, it has lists of categories like my accountant, people my kids go to school with, people I went to school with, people I go to church with, you know, all types of different categories. And once you give people something to get the ball rolling, it's amazing the brainstorming that comes out of this. And I suggest doing this as a group at one of your board meetings. When I do a board boot camp or board training session, I always include brainstorming as part of this, just to let them know that we do need your contacts, and you have to let them know how you're going to use those contacts. It may be to invite them to an event. It may be to add them to your mailing list. It may be to invite them to an open house. It could be a lot of different things. But you really need to do this brainstorming as a group, because sometimes it's amazing the connections that come out. And I guarantee you that doing this with your board, you will uncover a connection that you have no idea existed. I've done this numerous times, and I never cease to be amazed at the connections that people have on their board that they never knew existed. One of my favorite examples is a small community library where there was a individual, actually a couple in their community who were extremely philanthropic and extremely wealthy. And I thought, well, surely nobody on this board is going to know that couple. And I was amazed when one of their board members, who I would have never expected to have that kind of influence, was actually related to this couple, to the gentleman. So you never know who your board members know unless you start inviting them to do some brainstorming. So I want to leave enough time for questions and answers, and just kind of leave you with a couple parting thoughts. Is you might have thought going into this that you're building a fundraising board for you might be an extreme makeover, and maybe it is. But more often than not, I find that really it's just minor surgery. It might be just encouraging your board members to do the brainstorming. It might be getting them more involved in cultivation activities or identification activities. It might be teaming them up. It might just be providing them some education that they need. So for some of you, maybe it will be a major extreme makeover, but for many of you, it's probably just, you know, a little bit of tweaking here and there that you have to do with your board. So before I open it up for questions, I do want to make a special offer to all of you. I mentioned a couple times the board boot camp, which is a training session that I do with boards where I'll come in for usually about 4 or 5 hours and work with the board to, first of all, give them some education, but also provide them an opportunity to do some brainstorming. And for anybody who wants to take advantage of this board boot camp offer, before the end of June, you don't have to hold the event then, but just to make the commitment before the end of June. GiftWorks users, I would do this for $1,700 plus expenses, and non-GiftWorks users, it would be $2,000 plus expenses. So if you don't already have GiftWorks, you're probably better off buying it because you already saved most of that money in the board boot camp. So if anyone is interested in that, you can contact me offline, and I'll be happy to give you some more details. But I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. Before we do turn it over for questions, though, I do want to give you my email address and my website address, because I mentioned earlier, I know some of you probably have to sign off and you may not have a chance to get all your questions answered. And I do answer all emails. It sometimes takes me a couple of days, especially if I'm traveling and on the road. But just linda@lindalizakowski.com, or you can contact me through my website, which is cvfundraising.com. So I think, I'm not sure, Declan or Steve, who's going to handle the question and answers, but do we have some questions that we're ready to tackle?
Yep, Linda, this is Declan Murphy, and yeah, we just want to first off thanks everyone for joining us today, and Linda, thank you again for being with us. It's a pleasure, as always, to work with you, and I know you'll be back in July, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in a few minutes. But here's a question from Sarah. Can you speak to the need to have outside voices as well as inside, and how are those persons then brought up to the same level of belief in an organization?
I assume that that person means outside voices when it comes to going out and talking to potential donors. I do think it's important that the best major gift ask is usually the CEO of an organization along with a board member or another volunteer. And I think it's important to have both. Staff people, of course, are expected to do fundraising. They're paid to do fundraising, and in some cases their job almost depends on it. But I think more importantly, a volunteer just gives a whole different level of credibility to the ask, because typically they are someone who's at the same income level as the person they're asking. So if somebody's giving you a $10,000 gift, most likely they move in this kind of circles where other people that could give a $10,000 gift travel. And so they're going to have that relationship, which oftentimes staff does not have because they don't move in those same circles. So I think it is important to have both the internal voice of the staff person and the external voice of the board or volunteer member, because they bring a whole different level of connections and commitment to the organization.
Right. We're getting a lot of great feedback and questions here. If we don't get to all of them, feel free to email Linda at linda@lindalizakowski.com. But here's another one from Sylvia. She says, she asks, how do you structure a development committee? We have 12 board members, many of whom are already tasked with other responsibilities and commitments.
Well, I think with I could probably talk for another hour on this. In fact, I think I might have done a webinar on this for GiftWorks. If I didn't, we should probably plan one. But the key is that your development committee should not just be board members. One organization that I worked with, for example, had a board of 8 people, and they wanted to start doing fundraising, and we realized that out of the 8 people, there was probably 1 who even was willing to tackle fundraising. So we put that person in charge of the development committee, and we recruited 1 other board member that said, well, I'm willing to give this a try even though I don't know what I'm doing. So we had 2 board members, and we sat down with the 2 or 3 staff people, and we organized ourselves and said, well, who are some of the people that we could get on this committee other than board members? And we went out and recruited about, I think, 10 to 12 people from the community who were not board members. And that development committee was so strong and so powerful that the next year, when it was time to recruit more board members, like 2 or 3 people moved from the development committee onto the board. And after about 5 years, they went from a board of 8 very weak board members to a board of about 21 top-notch people. And it was all because of the development committee. So my best advice is don't just limit it to board members. Have a board member chair the committee, but then get some other community members, because it's a great training ground for future board members, and it also gives you the ability to get some specialized talents that you might not have on your board.
We have another question. This one's from Caroline White. How do you get a board development committee to build a plan less dependent on events and more on individual donors? Seems it always comes back to events.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is show the proof of what special events really cost. And another tool I have on my website is a special event analysis form that not only looks at what the actual net income is, and that's important because a lot of board members look at gross income and they don't realize that most events cost about 50 cents for every dollar that you raise. So look at your net income, but then also look at things like how much staff time did this take, how much volunteer time did it take, how many people did we reach through this event. You know, I always pick on golf tournaments because I think they're a perfect example of an event that really, and I love to play golf, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against golf, but when you're running a golf tournament, you're pretty much limited to 4 times 18 is what, 74 people or whatever it is that are going to attend that golf event, and so you really don't have much of a reach there, and a lot of organizations swear by golf tournaments, but when you think about it, it's not really getting you out there into the community that you need to do. So I think the first thing is to really do an in-depth analysis of your events and show your board members how much you're actually making on those events, and sometimes that is enough to do it right there.
Linda, we have about time for one more question, and
Okay.
like I said, if we didn't get to your question today, sorry, just time constraints, we want to respect that. You're probably at work, and we want to keep it to just a little over an hour. But email Linda at linda@lindalizakowski.com. That's linda@lindalizakowski.com. But how do you replace the bench sitters who are not really supporting the organization's fundraising? That was asked by Helen.
Okay, that's a great question, and I think the best way to eliminate bench sitters is to have that governance committee that I mentioned, and that governance committee should, at the end of the year, do a complete evaluation not only of the board as a whole, but as each individual board member. And I also have on my website, I think, some forms that you can use to help that evaluation process. But if somebody's not fulfilling their expectations, then I think it's time for the board chair to sit down with them, or the chair of the governance committee, or maybe the 2 people, sit down with them and say, you know, maybe being a board member is really not cut out for you. Maybe there's some other way you'd like to get involved in the organization. And I mean, I just had to resign from a board myself because I just didn't have the time to commit to that board, and I really felt bad because I certainly support the organization and will continue to support it financially, but I realized that they could replace me with a board member that would have a lot more time to commit to their cause. So I do think that, you know, most people would understand that when you sit down with them and tell them that. So I would suggest having that evaluation done on a regular basis and having the board chair and the chair of the governance committee sit down with that individual and just, you know, sometimes it might be that they just don't even know what the expectations are. Sometimes you can actually kind of salvage that board member if they really have that sit-down, face-to-face, you know, what they used to call a come-to-Jesus meeting, and I think sometimes you just need to do that with board members. So I guess we're probably out of time, huh? Or do we have one more?
We're pretty close. Actually, yeah, we're just about out of time, but we wanted to thank you, Linda, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you want to stay up to date on everything GiftWorks for future webinars and GiftWorks updates, check us out online. That's giftworksconnect.com. We're also on Twitter @GiftWorks, Facebook. If you have a question or want to join the community of GiftWorks users, check out LinkedIn for GiftWorks, and also GiftWorks 2013 is coming July 10th, so that is rapidly approaching. In GiftWorks 2013, there's constant contact integration, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, connectivity, and so much more. And check out the blog at giftworksconnect.com to read more about that. And Linda, would you like to close with any remarks?
It's really been a pleasure for me, and I do want to remind everybody to email me if you didn't get your question answered, and I will, by the end of the week, have answers back to everyone. And I'll look forward to also talking to you all on, remind me of the date again now, Declan, July 12th?
Oh, July 12th, yes. Yeah, we're looking forward to it. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Steve Faithful, CEO of GiftWorks.
Great, Linda, thank you so much for taking time to be with all of the people today. I know we're definitely appreciative, I speak on behalf of everyone on the team, on the GiftWorks team, that we're thankful that you could be here. And to all the people who are still here, there's a couple hundred of you here still listening. Thank you so much for taking time to invest in yourself and your organization. I really hope that you can take the things that Linda has shared and strengthen, whether it be your board, your fundraising, your mission. That's our hope. And so we're thankful to be able to host this webinar. I think, like Declan and Linda said, on July 12th, Linda's going to be presenting another webinar. We'll make sure we get you information about that so you can get registered for that. And we look forward to seeing the success that comes from what you're able to implement from these webinars. So thank you, Declan, and thank you, Linda, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.